Welcome. Can everyone hear me? Fantastic. My name is Brett Miller. I'm an AWS Solutions Architect. And here with me today we have Doug Vanderpool, a principal commercial consultant on the AWS advisory team. And we also have Brian Price, the CEO of CloudTamer. Today we're going to talk about unifying security, compliance, and finance teams with governance at scale. So why do you need to do this? Why is this even interesting? Why do you need to unify all the teams? Well, we found out working across AWS, across commercial accounts and public sector accounts, that different roles within an organization want different things. You have the CEO and the CIO wants dashboards. He wants red, green, yellow lights to know how their compliance is doing or how their finances are sit across their enterprise. You have developers and all they want is accounts, right? They want fast accounts, fast access to accounts. They just want the APIs. And you have the finance people that want to come in from the side and they want their own viewpoints. They want to understand how financials are being used. Are people within their budgets? Are they doing what they should be doing? Are they overspending? And after we heard these patterns coming across commercial and public sector, we decided to put our heads together around 3 years ago to kind of figure out the best of both worlds. Can we make everyone happy? Can we give the developers what they want? Can you give the high-level stakeholders the dashboards they need? And can you make sure that all the compliance and finances are taken care of? After working through this problem and after looking at different ways that AWS does this internally, we decided to congeal it into what we call the governance at scale framework. This framework is what we believe is a blueprint for success. It's the way that AWS manages thousands of accounts, and we believe it's the same way that customers can do it as well. So we're going to talk through this framework over the next hour and talk about some of the products like CloudTamer that have embodied this framework into a very easy to use and centralized solution for customers. But what are we going to talk about? We're going to do introductions. We're going to then talk about anti-patterns. Doug's going to come up and talk a little bit about what he sees across all of his commercial customers and which anti-patterns are becoming very common and how governance at scale and doing the advanced automation can help solve a lot of those challenges. I'm going to talk a little bit about Governance at Scale 101. If you haven't seen the white paper on our website, I'm going to go through some of the foundational elements and why it matters to you and why should you care about governance at scale. And then Brian from CloudTamer is going to come up and give you a kind of a brief intro on the product that they've built over the last 3 years that embodies all the principles that have been outlined in our white paper that's available on our website. And then we're going to go over some success stories. We have lots of success stories with governance at scale across not only commercial accounts, but also public sector accounts. And we're going to go through some of those success stories and why they were successful and why governance at scale can actually meet their needs. So as you move to the cloud, you'll find out very quickly that it's not just about a technology transfer. Right? When customers want to move to the cloud, they're primarily focused on moving out of their data centers and into the cloud, getting their apps off of their hardware and moving them into AWS. But well, they come to find out, yes, that's good things to focus on about doing the technical solutions, but there's a lot more to cloud transformation than just the actual physical transfer of assets. There's other things that need to be done to make an enterprise successful as they move into the cloud, right? You have to figure out how to buy in the cloud, right? You're very used to buying servers in the cloud, and there's a whole transformation about how you procure cloud, right? How do you install from where you were in data centers into the cloud? That's much different, right? You need to figure out how to pay as you go. You need to figure out how to do decentralized management and do self-service. And these are some of the components that we deal with at Governance at Scale, is to try to keep that swipe-as-you-go credit card experience you see on the outside world and make that very, very clean within an enterprise environment that's also moving to cloud. The other thing you'll be dealing with as you move into the cloud is not only the technology transfer, but also the culture changes. And what we found in professional services and across AWS, the culture changes are some of the hardest to deal with. In the old data center ways, you had a legacy culture of mother may I, right? Can I have a server? Am I approved for that server? What type of ticketing system do I have to go through to get to that server? In this new cloud culture, you want to eliminate that. You want to provide autonomy. So all your business units can go into the cloud as fast as they need to and get the resources they need. Governance at scale helps put in that level of automation so you have complete autonomy for business units in the enterprise so they can get the resources they want when they need it, but also have all of the guardrails and security placed within those accounts as they go very quickly into AWS. So when you deal with all three components and challenges as you go to the cloud, the people, the process, and the technology, you'll find that you can move much faster. You can move much faster. You can also go with a lot more confidence. Not just the confidence from the individual workloads going to the cloud, but actually have all of the CIOs and CISOs and all of the decision makers feel confident as they move faster and faster to the cloud. But once again, the point is you got to deal with all the factors outside of just the technology streams to get to be successful in the cloud, technology and people. So here's a graph that I like from a research company. And they asked, where does governance at scale fit in the transformation they see in a lot of agencies go through? And what we find is that when you start moving to the cloud, and you get initial wins and initial workloads in the cloud, that's relatively easy to do, right? You have a limited amount of services, you have only probably a small group of people, they're very agile and they can move much faster and they get quick wins. But as they get through those quick wins and basically the entire enterprise wants to move to the cloud, that's when a lot of manual-based processes start breaking down, right? You can no longer use spreadsheets to govern your environments. You actually have to be able to replace a lot of your manual-based processes with automation. You see the withering heights and the war and peace areas here is usually as things get more complex and everyone starts ramping is you have to deal with how to replace a lot of the manual methods with automation. Because what we find is as you go faster and faster, the manual methods cannot just keep up. So now Doug from the commercial side is going to come up and talk a little bit about anti-patterns. He's been traveling around talking about governance into a lot of our large commercial customers, and he sees a lot of things and a lot of lessons learned that he wants to talk about and how governance at scale can help get around a lot of those challenges.
Hey, good afternoon. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, all right, cool. All right, so we're going to talk about some of the stuff that I'm seeing with enterprise customers. We see really three kind of patterns happening these days. One is a situation where you've got some folks in your organization that are looking to do the newest thing, perhaps some difficult problems that the business is trying to solve, and perhaps on premises they don't have the capabilities that they need. So they look to the cloud to solve some of these problems, all right? Or to innovate, or to do things fast. Like Brett said, occasionally it's trying to get out of the way of IT, so maybe trying to go around them. You'll see this like the experimentation type, the POC type, so that's how things oftentimes we see them start. And then the second stage is where other folks see successes happening, right? So they see different areas of the organization succeeding. They see them using new technology. They maybe see them adopting things that they would also like to try their hand at. And they find out how they did it, and then this starts to build some groundswell. Eventually what you find over some amount of time, if you don't get your hands around this, is that you'll end up with a good bit of sprawl in the cloud. So you'll end up with a larger estate than was planned. Maybe IT is slightly involved, maybe not. You've got other organizations like security, operations, infrastructure that may have a hand in this, or maybe start to see, wow, okay, we've got some stuff that we need to get our hands around. And at this point, things start to really slow down. So the adoption reality, if you're looking at it from an infrastructure standpoint and from an account standpoint, you see in the beginning stages on the left, you see this, what seems to be a fairly simple picture with a handful of users, a handful of roles. You can relate this maybe back to your LDAP or back to your Active Directory in that structure. And then as the estate grows, it gets more complicated. You have more accounts, you have more roles, you have more users, you have more infrastructure getting laid down with more technology, and it gets complicated. Okay? Governance at scale is meant to address that in a scalable manner. And what do we mean by scalable? We mean that it gives different parts of the organization the ability to implement governance in different ways. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit about that more in a minute. So if you go back 5, 6, 7 years and you look at our recommendations, so go back to reInvent, and if you were to watch some of the presentations on security and account structure, you'd see a very minimum number of accounts. You might even see one account. So in the beginning, that was the recommendation. That recommendation has changed over time based on a lot of factors. But our current recommendation is a recommendation of many accounts. And I say many because there really isn't any limit. We have customers that have tens of thousands of accounts, and they can manage that many accounts and that much infrastructure effectively using strategies that we talk about in governance at scale. AI, ML, blockchain, whatever the next big thing is that we're not even talking about yet, the way I see this is if you don't enable your organization to adopt these technologies the moment that they are available, you're actually stifling creativity, you're stifling agility, you're stifling the ability for your organization to leapfrog the competition. And often what we see when we have centralized organizations, they put up roadblocks, right? And they stop this from happening. The concept of governance at scale, one thing you need to continually think about as you're implementing any kind of governance is how do you do this in a way that allows this freedom to continue. So I always, when I talk to customers, my recommendation is aim for allowing every developer, every data scientist to have their own account, okay? A little bit too much to go into today, but the idea there is to allow them that flexibility to iterate, to be agile, to innovate, to do creative and interesting things, and then move that out into outer environments in a safe manner. Again, enabling this agility, removing the barriers for teams, and driving the accountability and ownership of things like security, things like configuration, etc., down into the individual teams that are building these things. All right. Guardians at the gate. So what we've done over the past 20 years in IT, at least that's in my time in it, is we've started to consolidate. We talked about things like being able to scale. How do you scale in a large organization where you consolidate things like security, you consolidate things like operations, you consolidate things like infrastructure, and you homogenize it. I think with cloud, we are actually moving away from that these days. So we're allowing patterns to be constructed where the infrastructure, as the moment it's laid down, and then continuously over time as it's monitored, you know that it's safe, you know that it's secure, you know that it's configured in the correct way, and this allows you to push this out into the organization and allow accountability to be shouldered by these individual different organizations. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So the trade-offs that we see, I'm not going to read this one, it's a little bit of an eye chart. You all get copies of these slides. But the thing that I want you to walk away with here, again, is overemphasizing this idea of allowing each organization and each down to the developer level to have the freedom that they need to experiment and to build new things for the company. It's extremely important, and if you don't do this, you're going to lose out on a huge benefit of the cloud, as well as you're going to frustrate the organization as a whole, especially those that are the innovators in the organization. Avoiding departments of no, finding a way to yes. How do you do this? How do you do this in a large organization with maybe multiple CIOs and thousands of employees and people with lots of political capital and influence? You do that with a multi-account strategy that's flexible. You do that by building organizational support across the entire organization. How do you do that? One of the key ways in doing that is allowing this business autonomy. So implementing a governance structure that is flexible, that allows for, let's say, a base set of security and configuration. Thank you. A base set of security and configuration. And then you can use that as a baseline, and then you can expand and let the individual business units lay on top, or in some cases unlayer security. Okay, or configuration that a certain organization may need because they need to be FINRA or HIPAA or PCI compliant, for example, all right? And then we need to also integrate with all of these other enterprise tools that are being used today that all of the organization already is used to conducting business in. Things like ServiceNow, things like Salesforce, things like Terraform Enterprise or CloudFormation, or any kind of multi-factor authentication or SSO that needs to be integrated with. So whatever solution that you do, it needs to integrate with all of these things and do it in a way that that the organization is already used to operating in, okay? And then the last one is this notion of delegation of non-technical delegation and the implementation of non-technical interfaces. And what do we mean by that? Delegation is, like I said, what we want to do is push out this responsibility out into the individual product teams. They should be responsible for understanding what their product should do, and responsible for ensuring adoption of that product, ensuring that it's supported in production, and ensuring that it's secure, okay? I'm not saying that they do it alone. I'm not saying that these centralized organizations like security go away. What I'm saying is that these centralized organizations become providers of a service that's in demand by all of these different product organizations. So they actually pull these things in, okay? And the idea of the non-technical interfaces is to allow them to, for example, submit a request for a security exception or a configuration exception, but via an interface and not having to go through a ticketing process that has to be driven through IT and takes, has SLAs of days, weeks, months. This is what will stop your ability to innovate, it'll stop your agility, and it'll stop your growth as a platform in the end. Next, we're going to talk about governance at scale 101, kind of the main things that are key to that. And so that's the next point.
All right, thanks, Doug. So before we want to go any farther, if you have not read our white paper on our site, we kind of wanted to go through some of the foundational principles that help achieve governance at scale and create that kind of automated self-service enterprise cloud environment. But before we go into that, let's talk a little about why you may need governance. We find out that a lot of people need governance at scale end up having to answer yes to some of these questions. Is your cloud management team or your security team viewed as the department of no? Are they the blocker or the guardian of the cloud? Do you have to go through them? And is there typically a manual process in order to get to the cloud? That usually means that there's a lot of manual processes involved, and there has to be, and those manual processes need to be replaced with automation. The second one is you can't hire enough people to effectively manage your cloud presence and keep up with demand. A lot of agencies like to do a centralized cloud team, but as you scale into AWS, you find out that those centralized human-based teams cannot scale. There is no auto-scaling for people. Right? That's why you need to be able to take a lot of those decisions that maybe a small group does now and delegate them using automation to the different business units. not only does it allow that cloud team to scale, but it also puts a lot of those decisions where they need to be. They need to be closer to the data. They need to be closer to those business units which have ownership of those applications. So as you scale, it actually makes sense to actually see that PMO or that cloud team actually shrink, as a lot of those decisions get delegated down to the business units and closer to the data where it actually needs to be. Third, we've seen as a common pattern, if you have to request accounts and they always seem to go in a black hole, that's usually a sign that you need to automate some more governance around your enterprise. I've seen customers that it takes up to 6 or 8 weeks to get an AWS account. Some of them are maybe a week, some of them are 2 weeks, and some of them are actually 2 months. This is typically because there's a lot of manual processes in the way of getting those accounts. They have to figure out funding, they have to figure out security, compliance, business rules, all those things are all done manually, so therefore it takes a long time to get those accounts. Governance at scale enables you to create those automated workflows, so instead of an 8-week process, you can actually get an account that's fully ready to go into the hands of developers within the matter of minutes. And the other thing is, do your tested environments have to go through the same due diligence as production environments? In a lot of cases, they shouldn't, because they don't have the same due diligence, they don't have the same security. So there should be a way to automate requests for sandboxes and a lot of accounts that need to be provisioned out, either just for experimentation or for development and test. But all these questions, or we've seen signs that you probably need to automate your governance and do things more at scale so you can get bigger and bigger without having a lot of manual-based processes slowing down your migrations. So the governance at scale framework was started about 4 years ago. It was started because of customers. Customers kept asking us over and over again, how does AWS manage hundreds or even thousands of accounts? You guys have been doing it for years. Tell us how you do it. So we took a long, hard look on how AWS manages tens of thousands of accounts, and all the automation that goes into us internally being able to do this at scale. And we figured out it would be a good time to actually document a lot of those processes so they can actually be used by customers. So the governance at scale framework was born at that time. We think of it as the enterprise blueprint for success, because we know this is the way we manage our accounts, and it works for us, so therefore it should work for you. So not only we're drinking our own champagne, but we're providing this on our website. And if you just Google governance at scale, you can get a whole white paper on how to set up an automated governance system to get very close to the swiping action of a credit card that you would see if you were at home, but doing it at enterprise scale. When we started talking to a lot of customers about what governance means to them, and this is a survey we did across commercial and public sector customers, the 3 major pain points we decided to take on first were account management. So if you have 1,000 accounts, how do you manage all that, right? I have a large, diverse enterprise. How do I manage 1,000, 100, 10,000 accounts? We actually had one customer we're going to talk about later that wanted to manage up to 40,000 AWS accounts. They wanted to give account for every single developer. But with that scale comes complexity, right? How do you align those accounts to make it easy to manage? And one of the things we figured out is the customers wanted to use their hierarchy, or the way that their business is constructed, and align their cloud operations to that hierarchy. And since every customer is different, we figured out that if we could model their cloud operations into the hierarchy that makes sense to them, because that's the way they align people and processes and technology, it was going to make it a lot easier to scale, because hierarchies are the way that corporations scale and also public sector customers. So it made sense to align your cloud operations to a common hierarchy that just makes sense to the business. The second part of this was, how do you make it usable to non-technical stakeholders and developers alike, right? It's got to be really easy for developers to get what they need, but you also want kind of a visual interface for stakeholders like the CIOs and the financial people to get a bird's eye view of what's going on across the enterprise. Not everyone wants to dig into Lambda code and write a script to get data. They just want to see the data they need so they can actually make decisions either from a financial standpoint or from a security standpoint. So we believe it's foundational to create a easy-to-use interface to do just that. The second principle is about cost enforcement. This is probably the #1 ask for customers. They need to be able to align budgets to accounts or groupings of accounts across a large, diverse organization hierarchy and have the automation not only be able to report on how budgets are being maintained across large organizations, but also enforce it, right? A lot of our customers said it's not good enough to report that someone went over their budget. You need to have the automation in line so they don't go over their budget. So they can automatically know when things are happening and they're using more money that they've been allotted. And then if they ignore those rules, automation can actually take place. So this is very important to customers and is a foundational pillar of governance at scale that we align that says you really need to do this at scale, because once you have 10,000 accounts, you really need to have a proactive way of managing budgets across a large, diverse organization. And 3 is compliance automation. Once you align your cloud operations to your organizational hierarchy, it becomes really easy to start pushing security policies into those accounts via automation. And because you can push security policies, the compliance and the documentation becomes very easy to do. So once you use these 3 principles and you create a solution around governance at scale, you start going into addressing a lot of these components that I talked about previously. You have the people, right? You enable the people in your enterprise, your owners of your application, to be completely autonomous. They don't need to go to Mother May I to a central IT organization to ask for things. They can do things on their own because they have the ability and the technology and the process to actually do it. And then you also have the technology to automate all that, right? If you have 1,000 accounts, you really do need to automate all of those policies and protection mechanisms that are going to flow down that hierarchy and embody themselves into those AWS accounts so they can all be comfortable and stay in check around business rules in real time. So that's the framework. Didn't go into a lot of detail. I encourage everyone to look on our website and look at all the principles. We actually outline not only what governance at scale looks like, because we figured it out, because it's based on what we do internally and based on a lot of customer requirements that we've seen across a lot of different customer verticals. But we align the white paper at the end to have a set of requirements. So customers said, if I want to build my own governance at scale solution, what should it look like? Give me the goals that I should try to achieve. So we actually wrote an appendix in that website to give you kind of a checklist of what a good governance at scale solution should be. So it's very easy to use that as an input to your developers if you want to build your own governance at scale solution. However, what we're going to talk to next is not building your own. Some people choose to build their own systems. Some people would like to purchase a product that's more turnkey. So what we're going to talk about a little bit about now is a partner called CloudTamer that's taken our framework that we've put together over the last 3 years that we believe can help customers be successful, and they've built an entire commercial product around it. We're very proud of the work that they've done here with AWS and this embodiment of all these principles we've outlined in this white paper, and making it very easy for developers and non-technical people to get their jobs done as they accelerate adoption into the cloud. So I wanted to bring Brian Price from CloudTamer to talk about how their product is implementing governance at scale principles and makes it super easy and creates an easy button for enterprises to go faster into AWS.
Great. Thanks, Brett. So one of the things that we saw very early on, and you may be kind of seeing this as well, is governance is a big challenge, right? It's a challenge that a lot of organizations struggle with, and we saw that obviously as a tough challenge, but also a fantastic opportunity to help people accelerate that pathway to adapting kind of governance at scale, these practices that Doug and Brett have described here today, into a simple solution. So again, I'm Brian Price. I'm the president and CEO of CloudTamer, and again, really appreciate everybody coming out today to learn about governance at scale, learn about some of these best practices, and then after I'm done, we're going to talk a lot about success stories, which I think are really, really exciting to hear how customers have been successful in adopting this strategy to bring together those security and finance teams to be enablers in their organization. So just a couple quick highlights about CloudTamer and kind of our approach and how we look at governance and why we've seen it to be, I think, as successful as we have. So within CloudTamer, you'll notice a couple key differentiators that we try to call out and make sure customers understand. So one of which is, as Brett mentioned, when customers are looking at kind of compliance and financial controls, they're looking at more than just alerting and more than just notifications. They want to have buttons to be able to kind of turn off or pause spending. And unfortunately, it's a little bit counterintuitive to most cloud service providers to allow you to have that easy button to kind of turn that off. So what we try to do is make that very simple and really allow your organization to have the controls it needs to be able to enforce those security and compliance policies. Second, our approach is a little bit different than other products that you may have seen on the market. Again, embodying a lot of these principles in governance at scale. So when we talk to customers, especially at scale, you find that you've got different audiences that need different levels of access and different services, right? It's not just about basic compute, networking, and storage. It's about taking advantage of some of the latest services that get introduced at conferences just like this, as well as reInvent and others that are around. So we want to make sure that people in the organization can get the native access to AWS services and not have to go through what's kind of commonly referred to as a cloud broker approach or a cloud broker technology that sits right between the user and the cloud service provider. So they have to diminish those services down to the fundamental basic services. And we find that while that may be a great starting point for customers, it doesn't scale because different teams have different needs. As their maturity grows, they need to have the ability to get access to the native services within AWS to be able to innovate at the pace they want to. So the last thing I'll just highlight as far as a differentiator in our product that we saw, and again, based on the governance at scale framework, is the ability to unify teams together. So it's not just about being able to have an easy to use solution for your technical teams, because that drives your security teams and your financial teams crazy usually. Being able to have a solution that lets you have a single pane of glass that simplifies the access for your technical teams to get the resources they need, but also your security, your financial, your leadership teams to have the confidence that they can actually go into the cloud at greater scale and also with greater control than they could in any other environment before. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk about how we've taken those three pillars of governance, account management, budget enforcement, and compliance automation, and how it looks like in our product in this kind of simple, easy to use solution. So first with account management. So one of the foundational items that we found is that, again, that hierarchy is so critically important. You have a way that your organization works. You have a way that your cloud team works. Why not bring them together? Because it's so important to be able to have a common taxonomy that you can relate conversations to across your business. Because cloud, again, is not just a place where your applications are hosted. Cloud is, in fact, a model and a methodology and a cultural shift for most organizations. So what we allow you to do in CloudTamer is to build out a hierarchy, however wide, however deep, however diverse, however integrated together, underneath a model that makes sense for your organization. And then you can take and align those different cloud accounts to those different departments, to the different projects, and that way you can get a real-time view of what your cloud presence looks like in terms of the way the organization works. The second thing we found with account management was it's super critically important to be able to make sure that you make it easy for users to get into the cloud. And to do that effectively, we tie into a concept called federation. So if you've got an existing identity system like Active Directory or maybe a SAML-based provider, we want to make it so that you can tie CloudTamer to that provider, a user logs in once, and then they can federate to get in all of their AWS accounts. So that way, they don't have to go through separate IAM usernames and passwords and remember that, and really causes a lot of confusion and friction in managing cloud at scale. And the last thing, to tie back to Brett's point about automating accounts and making it easy for users to get access to the accounts that they need for their projects. If every person in the enterprise, and we've heard this over and over again, is really about, it takes them upwards of, sometimes 2 days to 2 weeks to 2 months to get accounts, that's a really counterintuitive experience to the cloud. People are expecting the cloud to be self-service, on demand. And so what we do is we tie into native APIs to allow accounts to be created automatically, but we allow you to take your existing scripts and automation that maybe you've already built to give the experience of the end user can simply request an account, it gets approved with a budget, and once the budget has been approved for that account, CloudTamer will automatically create the account, provision it, add your VPCs, and secure your account with some of the other capabilities that I'll talk about in a little bit. When we think about budgeting, again, very similarly here, the hierarchy is so important, but also we've realized that in commercial environments as well as public sector environments, most organizations don't have and don't treat money all the same. There's different potential types of money in an organization, whether it's operational money versus research funding. And then, more importantly, that money may have different periods of time when it's valid for. So we have a concept in CloudTamer we call funding sources that you can use to represent any type of money that you want. You can take that funding source, and then allocate that down to, say, these different departments that are depicted. And then from there, when a department needs a project, they can then create a spend plan that directs how that funding needs to be spent for that particular project. So it gives you a real-time view of how much money your organization's planning. So the second half of that is how much you're actually spending. So one thing that is maybe an undocumented feature, so to speak, in the cloud is it's really difficult to get an accurate picture of how much you're actually spending at any given time, and that real-time view is really challenging. So what we do in CloudTamer is we rely on the AWS native services like the cost and usage report and detailed billing report, and we supplement those services with things like real-time estimated spending to give you a much more real-time view of how much you're spending in the environment. And so both with that planned amount and that actual amount that you've spent, we can now allow you to set and enforce budget enforcement actions to do everything from just simply let people know, hey, we've got a potential issue, to going all the way and actually potentially applying policies to freeze spending in accounts, or actually going and terminating resources within those accounts. So obviously you probably wouldn't want to do that in a production environment, but for a lot of organizations, and like Brett described, and I'm going to describe a little bit later, on these success stories that we've had, customers want to be able to give a developer a sandbox account and give them a limit of $100 a month and say, that's your limit, and be able to take actual actions at that point if that limit is exceeded to actually reduce and remove the resources in that account. And then lastly, compliance automation. And what we really mean here is, again, going back to that hierarchical approach, is allowing you to set what we call in CloudTamer cloud rules, which are the combination of all the cloud service provider native services like IAM policies, cloud formation templates, service catalog products, as well as AMIs, right? And so all of those 4 items, right, are aggregated together into a cloud rule in CloudTamer, and that really allows you to be able to take and establish boundaries around your accounts. And you can apply those as granular or as broad as you need to. So at the very top of an organization, maybe you've got policies that every part of the organization should adhere to. Certain departments should have maybe others, like Department A here, needing to have a policy to enforce HIPAA data potentially, or healthcare, protected healthcare information. Department B enforcing a FedRAMP policy, and then allow, based on where that product or project lives, those policies to be automatically applied and enforced to ensure that the teams that have access to those projects can only use those specific services. We also have a process in CloudTamer to allow you to request exemptions as well, because everybody knows that there's undoubtedly needs to have teams be able to request and say that these particular policies, they just don't work for me. I need to be able to be exempted to use the latest and greatest service. Maybe I'm not using it in a production environment, and I should be allowed to do that. And that workflow is very intuitive, and it also embodies there the concept of delegation in governance at scale, where those policies, depending on where they're applied, will then allow an organization to be able to then request and then approve that exemption at that level, which means you don't have to have a single security team that just grows bigger and bigger and bigger by the day. Instead, you can have different people delegating with having delegated responsibilities at every level to make those decisions relevant to them. So, before I kind of wrap up, I just want to encourage you, if any of this is interesting, if you'd like to see a little bit of how this actually works, please stop by kind of the expo area. We're in booth 234. We've got a team of people there that would love to chat with you, learn a little bit more about your use cases, and see if there could potentially be a fit to help you adopt governance at scale. So I'm going to turn it over to Doug, and he's going to talk a little bit about some success stories that we've seen, first in some commercial environments, and then we're going to go through some other environments as well that really have adopted this governance at scale framework.
Hello again. I do realize that I am between you and maybe a further deeper discussion with us on the side after this, and or a cocktail or something, because it's getting late. So we'll spin through these, but I think they're important, and they really embody implementations of all of the things that we've talked about today. So, you know, what I've found in all the customers that I've worked with is that as you scale cloud, pain follows pretty quickly. All right, not unlike large on-premises environments. But what you'll also see is with pain, people start to become willing to make changes, and things that seemed really daunting and perhaps challenging, maybe off the wall, become more in focus, and people are more able to digest them. And so sometimes what we see is, in fact, that you have individual organizations have to see some pain before the message becomes resonant. So the fact that you're here, hopefully you're here early in your journey, thinking about this from day one, there are ways that you can implement these frameworks and limit the amount of governance that you actually put in the framework. But as long as you have the framework there, you're going to be way ahead in all of this. Next is integration is hard work. Again, this is a global leader in entertainment. The reason that I put this one in here is because this particular company tried to do this and build the integration themselves, okay? And then after over a year of trying to build it themselves and trying to get budget for other organizations within their company to fund improvements and integration development efforts, they finally kind of threw in the towel and implemented, in this case, CloudTamer. So don't forget the lessons that you've learned in the past, since we've all been doing this for a long time. Remember how hard integration is, and try and, to the best of your ability, purchase solutions that are loosely coupled, like CloudTamer. And what I mean by loosely coupled is they use all of the native interfaces with AWS. So whether you build it yourself or you go looking for a solution, make sure it's loosely integrated, it uses the APIs, and that way, if you decide to tear it out or we build something, we meaning AWS, build something that provides that kind of functionality, it's easy to move from one to the other. Again, speed and ease of implementation are super important, and the governance at scale concepts that we talk about are foundational, and I would contend that there isn't an enterprise that would succeed without implementing them. And again, this was a good example, global, large company, multiple CIOs, and the only way we finally got them to buy into actually implementing this across the board was, in fact, to allow them to see that they could choose to implement certain things and choose not to implement others, even though in the end, almost everyone chose to implement everything. So with that, I will give it to Brett for the next example.
All right. Talk a little bit about NASA. So I had the pleasure of working with NASA, which is one of our largest governance at scale implementations. NASA specifically moves a lot of data from their satellites and their orbiters to AWS. They deal with a lot of scale, right? And they've been with AWS for many years. But one of the problems they had is about cost. They were very concerned with the petabytes they were bringing into AWS, that costs were going to get out of control. And as they moved from singular accounts in AWS to a multi-account approach, they didn't understand how they were going to manage it all, right? They knew that a singular account could not work, but they also knew hundreds of accounts would come with its own complexity. So they were a very natural fit for governance at scale. What they needed, and they told us very clearly, they need a platform, not a gate. They need a self-service platform which any person in the agency could actually use to get an account very quickly. It could take care of all the cost controls. They could put budgets around those individual accounts, and it needed to be really easy to do. They did not want a lot of manual processes in the way, and they just needed it to get the accounts out in a governed way, but in a very fast way. So they decided to go to Cloud Tamer as well. They actually used a uniform authentication mechanism, SAML, in order to get people into that environment. That SAML assertion can then map them to the different accounts that they have access to. Depending on their roles that are defined in Active Directory will define which accounts they can get access to and what they can do within those accounts. It also enforces two-factor authentication that can be controlled centrally. And most important is Cloud Tamer provided NASA the ability to do cost controls, right? Not just alert people on when financial guardrails are not being met, but actually put in proactive enforcements if necessary by the business. This is an example of their interface showing that they're able to not actually have the financial people understand the financial state of their accounts, but also give that information to their developers. Because they learn very quickly if they can put the data in front of their developers' monitors that shows that their engineering decisions have an impact on their budget, you can actually change behavior. Because if a developer knows when he makes a change or when he creates a new EC2 instance, he sees the fluctuation of his budgets, he will actually start making better decisions. He can no longer say, I don't know what the money situation is, because it's shown to him as they log into the interface. That is very important, not only for the financial people to roll up the budgets to know who's spending what, but to give that really good granular information to the people that are actually making the engineering decisions for the organization. So after about 2 years, they are using AWS and Cloud Tamer successfully. They're at massive scale. If you want to learn more about what they do in AWS, they were at the Public Sector Summit last week, and all of their information is on YouTube. But this is one of our largest customers that really has to deal with that translation from a singular account to a multiple account approach, and how do you manage all that complexity? And they're using governance at scale to do just that. So that's NASA. Now Brian is going to come up and talk a little bit about another use cases which have been very successful.
Great, thanks, Brett. So we've kind of seen about a couple of these different organizations really kind of looking at scale in a couple different ways, and this is also a bit of a different scale as well. So this kind of journey for this customer is one of our Department of Defense agencies that we work with, started about 4 years ago, and they basically were honestly seeing the systematic problems of a recruiting problem where they were trying to hire the best and brightest talent. They brought them into the organization, they sat them down into a desk, they took away all their phones and gadgets. Then they said, okay, here's the environment they want you to build a solution on, and it looked like 5-year-old technology, and they were wondering why they were struggling capturing and retaining some of the best talent that they wanted to have to innovate in some of the most challenging problems. And so what they kind of set out to do was build an environment that would allow customers, and their customers being developers and other internal users in their environment, to have really self-service access and to scale up to 10, 20, 30, 40,000 developers to have their own accounts in AWS, to have as native and as rich of an experience as possible in the cloud that they before weren't able to really do. But when you have that size of scale, right, from a security and a financial perspective, what could possibly go wrong? So what they decided to do, and what we kind of helped them with in conjunction with one of the partners that we work with called Strata Solutions, and they have a managed service framework called Altitude, is kind of build out kind of a cloud at scale environment that encompassed Cloud Tamer in the center kind of from a centralized governance perspective. But it gave the end developers access to native AWS services. It allowed self-service access to be able to give teams the ability to go and create their own accounts in their projects as soon as they've been approved, to reduce the friction that it takes to get into the cloud. They integrated security as a thread from the very beginning inside of this project, so it's all integrated. So instead of having, again, this culture of no, right, that you can't do something, they instead monitor everything that goes on in the environment. They've got algorithms that they use to train to see if there's certain anomalous behavior, and then they take actions based on that behavior. But instead of being seen as disablers, they're actually enabling speed to get into the environment, because again, they've set boundaries in place and allowing teams to be able to operate within those boundaries. And then lastly, the teams that ultimately decide things, the budget, the compliance teams in leadership, really got to a point where they felt they had so much better insight on this investment of using the cloud. They were seeing productivity. They were seeing tens of teams being more efficient in building solutions in AWS. And so ultimately the results that we kind of saw in that organization are around kind of 4 key areas. So scalability, they were able to kind of get on that path to be able to support that many users because they were using a scalable architecture that embodied some of these best practices. The speed of which they were able to get accounts and resources were unrivaled in anything else that they had used in the past. Security, being able to have that integrated and threaded throughout their environment is so critically important. And then lastly, from a compliance perspective, what we found was that those organizations that were building solutions in this environment had better assurance that somebody wasn't going off and building an application using a service that maybe they weren't approved for, maybe it wasn't FedRAMP certified, or maybe it didn't adhere to some security standard. They were able to actually enforce what people were supposed to be using in that environment, which is extremely important, again, at scale, so that you don't have to go one by one, and you make sure that you've got cost-effective solutions being built, as well as solutions that don't have to be re-engineered because they chose, say, a wrong service or something that won't be approved to operate in that environment. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Doug to kind of wrap us up today and talk a little bit about some of the recap, as well as just recommendations to take with governance at scale.
Thanks, Brian. All right, so we'll wrap this up for today. Just a few more slides here. The key recommendations here: implement a scalable, hierarchical, automated governance solution. So we talked at fair length about this. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but clearly scale is important here. We talked about how you scale. Hierarchy is really important here. Being able to both construct a hierarchy that will work from a financial perspective, like organizations are constructed today, as well as a hierarchical fashion in terms of maybe you've got a PCI environment or a HIPAA environment. You need to be able to define that and know which systems, which accounts, which infrastructure within those accounts, are part of that environment so that you know when you push change or configuration updates or new requirements come out, you know which systems, which infrastructure needs to be touched and managed. And you can imagine the bigger you get, this can get quite complicated, especially on premises. I mean, I managed a lot of really large environments, and this was a constant struggle for us. Every year we would go through this audit, and if you do this correctly, you really can manage that audit all year long, and it nearly becomes printing a piece of paper and going through a basic exercise. Next is balance boundaries and guidelines with user capability and speed. Don't go all the way one direction either way. You need these centralized organizations in many cases to produce patterns and to ensure that people who have questions on security, configuration, operations, infrastructure, they have a place to go ask and look for expert advice, but also let the individual teams be responsible for these things. Next is start with what I call a minimum lovable product. So don't go collect requirements and build something that's going to take a year to get into production. It just doesn't make sense these days. You can stand up infrastructure super fast. You can get a minimum product out there for users to use. I think we do that as well as anybody. You can see what both Amazon and AWS do. Some of the services that we put out, they're lacking in their richness of feature set when we first put them out, but that comes quickly, especially for those features and services that are highly in demand. So that's the way you want to work in your own business. Buy, build, or partner, set time frames, get this done. Next is define your success criteria and continually measure and report. Probably goes without saying, but just standard kind of practice. So what do you do next? So after hearing all that we have to talk about with governance at scale, there is professional services offerings that you can reach out to your AWS rep, and we have what we call align engagements, launch engagements, and scale. Align, launch, scale, you can guess what that means. Align is really just kind of, hey, making sure everybody understands what we're talking about and is agreeing that, yes, that's something we want to do. A launch is something like a POC. It puts it into your environment, gets it working, shows that it can work, all that sort of thing, and really puts kind of minimum viable governance in your minimum lovable product, if you will. And then scale is implementing this fully, okay? And we can do this with both CloudTamer and other third parties, and or develop your own. So with that, I want to thank you all for attending. I know it's getting late in the day, but I appreciate all the attention. And if you are as passionate about governance as the three of us are, we encourage you to both complete the survey, please do that. And then also, if you want to come up and chat with us, we can have a discussion here. We can take it outside and continue it over a beverage, but would really enjoy a further on conversation if you've got questions or want to give us any feedback on the presentation. Thank you very much for your time, and have a great rest of the conference.